You know, having been making videos on this site for a few years now, I don't think I've really done one on a superhero movie before. Although Power Rangers 2017 and Sucker Punch technically count, I seem to have stayed out of the comic book movie conversation altogether. And I do worry that sometimes I come across as one of those annoying contrarians who insist that the MCU is killing cinema, which I don't think is the case at all. Although I effectively stopped watching at Guardians 3, I'm not anti-superhero movies at all, and I never have been. In fact, I'd happily argue that one of the reasons for how long that particular subgenre has endured is because the framework lends itself to so many different types of stories. It can sometimes be forgotten when there are so many blockbusters full of costumed vigilantes fighting crime being released every year, but even that one cinematic universe has had many films that I genuinely think will be seen as classics in the years to come. And I can remember at the start of the 2010s when I was a too-cool-for-school youngling that cynically thought superhero movies were dying out after hearing of disasters like the Green Lantern, only to have my mind changed when I saw the Avengers with no preceding knowledge of anyone else's films or what a shared universe even was. So I set a narrative in my head that the 2010s was the decade that saved the superhero movie and dismissed the 2000s completely. After all, the 2000s was the era of every cinematic superhero having to wear black and never using their code names, and everything taking itself way too seriously without that refreshing self-awareness and bathos to allow the audience to feel like they were in on the joke. And also, there were plenty of bad apples spoiling the whole bunch. Never mind that the 2010s had plenty of stinkers as well. But now, we're 20 years removed from the first decade of the 20th century, and of course, it's time for a reappraisal.
Go to hell, Diablo. Okay. But you'll beat me there.
In my small-town upbringing in backwoods Ireland, we didn't get comic books, and I didn't even own one until 2014, and yes, of course it was a charmed one. Whose f***ing channel is this? So my introduction to all these icons was through cartoons, such as the various Spider-Man ones, and the super formative X-Men Evolution, and I saw their respective films in the cinemas, and even kinda sorta liked X-Men The Last Stand. But I'd be lying if I said the most formative superhero movie for me was one featuring any of those characters.
You killed the only two people I ever loved. Why?
Daredevil was a character I was aware of through some Spider-Man video game my brother played that I don't remember the title of, and I knew so little about him that I didn't even know the character was blind.
The blind lawyer from Hell's Kitchen.
I think I only knew about the movie because the famous Evanescence song Bring Me to Life was tied to WWE's No Way Out pay-per-view that year, and yes, that scene ended up becoming my trash, and I may have tried to recreate it in my much tinier room, substituting tattoos, all the things she said, because how more 2000s can you get? Even now, when I have an entire section devoted to the problems with that character, I happily YouTube that scene multiple times a year. The Daredevil movie hit me in a way that the other movies just didn't, even though I love them too. Sure, I'd seen Uncle Ben get shot and Magneto's prologue, but the main character being blinded as a child and later finding his father dead? The superhero being shown with scars, cracking knees, and broken teeth from his heroism? The female lead trying to kill the hero and eventually dying in a fight with the villain? I was of course way too young to understand the more mature themes such as parental disappointment, getting trapped in a life of crime, and the flaws in the justice system, but still, it was something I literally had not seen before. And then, when the Christopher Nolan Batman films came along and got all this praise for stripping everything back to grounded realism and away from superhero camp to make you forget you were watching a comic book movie, I wasn't all that impressed really.
What happened? Your balls drop off?
I mean, I enjoyed the films, and of course Heath was iconic as the Joker, but my favourite is actually the third, or at least that's the one I find most interesting, despite its many, many flaws. Daredevil already had that effect on me, but once I grew too old for comic book movies, I put it to the back of my mind and did not think about it again until I was something of an internet veteran, and read all about how the Daredevil movie was bad actually, or only average at best. I decided to rewatch it to see if it held up, and it didn't. I found it rushed, paced very strangely, and with the characters almost paper thin. Not to mention how ferociously miscast Jennifer Garner was as Elektra.
I didn't kill your father!
Liar!
And since it was the 2010s, I found the stylism and more over-the-top elements to be embarrassing. So why am I doing a video on how the Daredevil movie is good, actually? Because a couple of months ago, I stumbled across this fantastic video by Alex of High Top Films, doing a far better deep dive into the movie than I could ever hope to, and he spoke about the merits of the director's cut. And I was so compelled to seek it out, I ordered the first DVD I'd ever bought this decade since I couldn't find it streaming anywhere. And that is indeed how we arrived at this title. So let's get to it. So, as was the case with so many of these 2000s movies, the studio ordered significant cuts and reshoots for a theatrical release, later giving the directors a chance to restore something closer to their vision for a special DVD release once the panic surrounding the theatrical box office take had subsided.
To the very best of wives.
These edits were ordered for the following reasons. To reduce runtime in the fear that audiences wouldn't sit through a long movie, which is especially weird considering Daredevil's director's cut is only just over 2 hours. To remove content that would get the movie slapped with an R rating and prevent kids and families from seeing it legally, thus narrowing the box office take. To add in more romance, and emphasise Elektra's screen time at the expense of Matt's in the hopes of setting up a spin-off movie for her. And finally, to trim the fat and simplify the movie down to make it less dense for audiences. So altogether, the director's cut runs 29 minutes longer than the theatrical one, and yes, the pacing issues and underdeveloped feel that I complained about in the theatrical cut are gone completely as a result.
I believe you.
The biggest difference is the presence of an entire subplot that greatly fleshes out Matt's characterization.
Get yourself defense.
After the lengthy sequence where Matt dishes out his brand of justice to Quesada, a criminal acquitted of SA charges thanks to the Kingpin's influence, and he's done his usual nighttime routine and been dumped over the phone, he hears the sounds of a woman being attacked, and knowing he won't get there in time to save her, has to sit there and listen to her be shot, and his next client is the man charged with her murder. Except, Matt's powers allow him to know this man is innocent, and he does some sleuthing to try and uncover the real culprit, which ends up connecting the dots to allow him to find out that Wilson Fisk is the Kingpin.
Lisa Tazio had access to the Kingpin?
The love scene between Matt and Elektra in the theatrical cut is also removed, and in its place, at the end of their kiss on the rooftop, Matt overhears another crime and actually leaves a confused Elektra there, which is why he apologizes for the other night the next time he sees her.
I'm really sorry.
You're here now.
Now already, these greatly improve Matt's characterization compared to the theatrical cut, where he comes across as a generic sad boy who ignores a person in distress to go fool around with Elektra, and his jaded attitude is less understandable.
Seeing eye dogs bond for life. Yours ran away. What does that tell you about how emotionally available you are?
These scenes also further develop Matt and Foggy's friendship, and give Ellen Pompeo a little more to do as Karen. Bullseye scenes are spaced out in a way that makes the character less bombastic. There's an absolutely vicious addition in Elektra's death, where Bullseye gives her an unwanted kiss as she's dying, as well as extending the fight scenes and adding a little more brutality, and while I wouldn't say there's anything too R-rated, they fit the darker tone this was going for. The end result is not only a stronger movie, but something that still gives me the same feels that I got watching the theatrical version as a kid. I'm even going to go out on a limb here and say that, had this been what was released, to this day, people would be talking about Daredevil with the same reverence that people use when speaking about Batman Begins.
Excuse me.
Okay, maybe not that much praise, but it would definitely be included in those conversations. Because its characterization... It's not hard to assume that some of the savagery directed towards the film came from overexposure backlash Ben Affleck was experiencing thanks to being the lead in some movies people really didn't like, such as Pearl Harbor and Jiggly, but mainly for being a constant presence in the tabloids, courtesy of who he was engaged to. And I wouldn't be surprised if the studio cut out most of a subplot involving the title character in favour of hyping up Elektra to try and avoid this backlash. The film was financially successful, so your mileage may vary on whether that worked or not, but he was singled out for seeming one-dimensional. I'm not the biggest Ben Affleck defender out there, since I found myself preferring him in roles where he gets to quirk it up and have fun, like Shakespeare in Love.
I'm the money.
Then you may remain, so long as you remain silent.
But I enjoyed the town, and I was fairly meh on him as Batman, and I'm one of those people who wasn't blown away by Good Will Hunting, but on watching the director's cut of Daredevil over and over again, guys, I'm being serious. This is actually my favourite Affleck performance.
I'm in the Fight Club. And it's the first rule of Fight Club. Don't talk about Fight Club. So you're not in the Fight Club. You're out of it.
With these 29 minutes restored, you can see the perfect balance that was lacking in the theatrical version. This Matt Murdock is jaded and cynical, but still warm and hopeful, and can't bring himself to turn his back on the people that need him. He makes sacrifice after sacrifice at great cost to his own mental health, and you can feel his pain, but also understand that he wouldn't have it any other way.
Can one man make a difference? There are days when I believe, and others when I have lost all faith.
Having to let Lisa Tazio be murdered while he can hear everything haunts him, and you can feel his determination to get justice for her. And it all linking back to the Kingpin makes for a very neat character arc, all things considered.
Justice is served.
It's a lot more complex than Peter Parker learning that he has to use his powers to make a difference, or Logan learning to be a team player, which isn't to shit all over those arcs either, since it's an apples and oranges situation. And of course, the typical Spider-Man arc is of a teenager who has to learn to grow up and be an adult, and the Wolverine arc is a lot more fantastical, involving love triangles and amnesia. Daredevil also shows the day-to-day life of a working-class adult with a disability, and Ben Affleck went to a lot of effort to portray Matt's blindness as honorably as he could, wearing contact lenses that blocked out his vision in a lot of scenes, and this part of the movie was always so engaging to me even as a kid, and it becomes even more so with those extra 29 minutes.
We want sympathy, it's not the gun show. Yeah, okay.
With the added subplot of him trying to clear Dante Jackson's name, it adds even more power to this scene, where he beats up a criminal who he then realizes was in a position similar to his father, with a child looking up at him in terror.
I'm not the bad guy, kid.
A touch I also love that yanks at the heartstrings is the change from how Matt gets blinded as a child. Traditionally, Matt saves an old blind man from a runaway truck carrying the chemicals that then splash over his eyes. But here, especially in the director's cut,
They said that you work for Fallon. That you're one of his guys now.
the prologue shows that Matt's father Jack lied to his son that he was doing honest work at the docks, and Matt finds out when he visits to show him a report card with all A's, then finding his dad threatening someone at the orders of a crime duco called Fallon, who Papa Murdock swore he had nothing to do with, and running from this is what leads to Matt being blinded. So his disability being linked to his father's ultimate broken pedestal moment is the type of knife-in-the-heart brilliance I associate with the dress-ripping scene in Cinderella. And David Keith does not have a lot of screen time, but he really sells this.
I'm sorry, Maddie. I'm so sorry.
As a kid, I distinctly remember never seeing any scene where a parent admits to screwing up and cries in their child's arms. So this was a huge revelation. Further heartstrings tuggage comes from how this is what convinces Jack to step it up as a parent and never disappoint his son again, trying his best to get his life back on track, even seemingly winning several boxing matches, only for Fallon to try and pull him back into that life of crime, and Jack refusing to let his son down again is what leads to his death. Uncle Ben getting shot for doing the right thing is sad. This is pure heart-twisting tragedy gold. And Scott Terra is so good as the young Matt.
I can't see you dead.
I could have happily seen him carry a whole film, but of course, Gentle Ben is good too, and it's his line here that actually prompted waterworks on the most recent rewatch.
No one cared much about the death of a washed-up prize fighter. Nobody but me.
I connected to Matt's story in a way that I never did to Bruce Wayne in the Nolan trilogy, or Peter Parker in the Raimi trilogy, and indeed the two web films. For me, the main hero was always the necessary evil, or the vanilla one we needed to introduce us to a spectacular world so I could be all about the more fantastical supporting cast. But here, I'm all about Matt and what makes Daredevil tick. Maybe because I too am a disabled adult with a history of being emotionally unavailable, who's often tried to pour from an empty cup to help a never-ending stream of people in worse situations and gotten very jaded about it. Of course, my brand of vigilante justice extends to strongly worded letters telling people off as opposed to... And like I praised Mulan in my Disney Princess video, Matt here is a character that's both affirmational and aspirational, in a way that Spider-Man or any of the Singer-directed X-Men weren't. While I'm told that the movie only scratches the surface and the series was able to go far deeper by comparison, I will always have a soft spot for Ben Affleck's Daredevil, and unlike his Batman, this is way more deserving of respect. But alas, the 2003 movie may be significantly improved by the extra 29 minutes in the director's cut, but there's still one glaring flaw. I've become something of a broken record in taking an often criticised or misrepresented heroine from the girl power era of genre movies and defending her to my last breath, but that is something I can't fully do here. And make no mistake, there is promising material here.
Stay with me.
Elektra is the anomaly among the female leads in a lot of the 90s and 2000s superhero movies. Most of them were civilians, who provided the heart of the story in their required function as the love interest. You'd only get an action girl in an ensemble like the X-Men movies. And even then, notice how Rogue becomes the damsel in distress, which is a plot point I liked, just saying. But Elektra is already established as a trained fighter in her second scene, which involves her sparring with a blind man in the middle of a children's playground, which... Okay, is this gal under some kind of Red Sonja enchantment where no one gets to the bedroom until they put her on her back in other ways? Actually, make that movie. I want to see Red Sonja and Daredevil as love interests. Anyway, this scene is ridiculous, and yet I can't help but grin only half ironically, if that's at all possible.
So does every guy have to go through all this just to find out your name?
Try asking for my number.
But yeah, the midpoint of this superhero movie is when the love interest's father is killed and the hero is framed for it. So with her action girl credentials already established, she plans to get revenge on her father's masked killer, not knowing it's also the man she loves. And yeah, we had seen the hero and love interest fighting and the other thing, and if I mention that this is my favourite Batman movie, you'll probably guess that this is a trope I'm quite fond of. But this choice to have Elektra portrayed as something of a composite of another Daredevil love interest, Echo, whose father was killed by the Kingpin, turns her into a foil for him, which doesn't often happen with the female lead of a superhero movie, let alone the love interest. Daredevil coped with loss by trying to help prevent suffering. Elektra, however, wants to dish out more of it to alleviate her own pain. Daredevil wants justice, and Elektra wants revenge, culminating in what for her is a moment of horror when she refuses to listen to him both times, and unmasks what she thinks is her father's killer, and realizes she may have killed the only person she had left. There is something very powerful about her discovering that Daredevil is Matt, and then instantly realizing that he wouldn't have killed her father. But then when Bullseye reveals himself, she again doesn't listen and pursues revenge rather than justice, to her downfall. And while it's not fully canon accurate, it's rich enough material if the right actor is in the role. If. Besides the obvious of Elektra being Greek and Jennifer Garner being as waspy as they come, she just isn't the right fit for an action girl, even if she got fame playing one in the series Alias. And yeah, this was the early 2000s, with the heroin chic body standards still fresh in everyone's minds, so you weren't going to get a Gina Carano type, and they'd never cast Michelle Rodriguez as the love interest. This wasn't feminism, this was girl power, so your action girls were all wafy and glamorous. But there were plenty of actresses who could bring the physicality to make you believe it. Kate Beckinsale as Selene in Underworld is a defining example. You can feel the coldness and stoic hatred with every Lycan she kills to avenge her family. And in Van Helsing, the pain and desperation when she tries to get even with Dracula.
Think if you're going to kill someone, kill them! Don't stand there talking about...
Keira Knightley was able to bring it in King Arthur 2004 as well. Sienna Miller didn't think she was able to as the Baroness, but I think she did.
Get out! Nice shoes.
Hell, I'm not going to claim that Mila Jovovich is some kind of Shakespearean thespian, but in the Resident Evil movies, you bought it instantly that she would F you up. Jennifer Garner lacks the fierceness to really make this character work. She's fine in the romantic scenes, but I cannot buy her for a second as a ruthless vigilante.
I want to look into the eyes of my father's killer as he dies.
Take the infamous Bring Me to Life scene. I can't feel the rage. I can't feel the hatred. None of the self-loathing that should be on full display. Jennifer Garner is at her best in something like 13 Going on 30, when she's exuding adorable goofiness or pure heartfelt emotion.
You're my best friend.
She herself was clearly more comfortable in comedies and more emotional roles, since she only did the Elektra movie because of contractual obligations. And everyone else here was so perfectly cast that it's sometimes painful, because the director's cut is this close to being a 10 out of 10 for me. You know who was at the peak of her career in 2003? Could most definitely do the action, proved to be quite decent when she did an action movie, and actually is part Greek? For non-WWE fans, I give you Trish Stratus. Not only my future wife for several years, but also something of an idol for when I gave wrestling a try and used this move in tribute. But I'm supposed to be doing a defense video, so let's move on to... I already sang the praises of David Keith for doing a lot with the small role of Jack Murdock in the prologue, to the point where if you only watched his portions, you'd be forgiven for thinking he's the lead in his own little Rocky film somewhere else. And his chemistry with Scott Terra is so good, you can easily buy them as father and son.
You can do anything if you're not afraid.
Jon Favreau is genuinely funny and charming as Foggy Nelson, and the director's cut reveals some nice buddy cop movie chemistry with Ben Affleck.
Well then, as your attorney in this matter, I advise you to marry the woman immediately.
Joe Pantoliano gets to do a rare departure from his slimy villain roles like Cypher, and play that other heroic comic book journalist.
It's me, Ben Yard.
Yeah, I know who it is.
Again, putting so much into that role, and feels like he's in his own little film as he pieces together clues to uncover Matt's identity. The late Derek O'Connor does likewise in his small part of Father Everett, with his scenes having a lot of unexpected heart. And yay for them getting an actual Irishman.
I like the quiet. I don't think so, son. I think you like the solitude.
But I guess that's a decent segue to...
I wanna fucking cost you.
I'd seen hometown boy Colin Farrell in a movie called Phone Booth and didn't understand how he could be Irish if his accent sounded American because, folks, I was not a smart child. But this was my first Colin Farrell experience knowing exactly who he was, and my god is he fantastic as Bullseye.
Hey, Orphan! Let's play!
No notes. Notes are not possible. He'll have stolen the pen from me and used it to blind 3 people before I can even think. He was drawn to the role because it would be 12 days of work, 7 scenes, and a chance to, using his words, check your subtlety at the door and be as camp and over the top as possible. And that is exactly what he did.
Bullseye.
He also gets to use his own accent without being a leprechaun, terrorist, or fetish object. This movie is downright radical in terms of Irish representation, but speaking of representing, Michael Clarke Duncan. I think one aspect of this movie we're all in agreement on is that he is absolutely fantastic as the Kingpin.
That's all it ever is, business.
Fun fact, Wilson Fisk was intended to be black from the beginning, but one of the editors was afraid it would be racist to have a black villain, which, considering the character debuted in 1967, isn't an unfair assessment. But of course, 2003 was a different world, not just because we'd had 6 seasons of a different world, and Michael Clarke Duncan was deemed the best actor who also had the physique the character called for, but he also gained 40 pounds because of course he did. He invented that before Christian Bale made it cool, and since The Green Mile was before my time, my introduction to MCD was through this and Sin City, and I so wish it had been through the intro they give this character in the director's cut.
Leslie, handkerchief.
He's definitely one of those actors who struck a balance between grounding their villain in some form of realism, while also having a blast being evil. But besides giving a great performance, here's a comment that made a very good point about this character. While most villains would continue to send their henchmen after the hero, then retreat when the hero gets close, the Kingpin does the opposite. He sends his henchmen home, he stays right where he is, and faces Daredevil like a man. And one thing to really appreciate about the final confrontation between Kingpin and Daredevil is that it's not a world-saving spectacle like Liberty Island, or a quartet taking down one superpowered baddie, or a save the girl scenario followed by letting the villain destroy themselves. It's a brawl between 2 men from the same background who grew up into very different people. And there's also the implied coolness of Daredevil having to face Kingpin in an empty building with the lights turned out, so that the most prominent sound is his enemy's heartbeat on the top floor just waiting for him. And after showing that Daredevil is no match for him in a fair fight, he gets done in with that nifty Chekhov's loophole establishing that rainfall allows Daredevil to see somewhat. And subverting the trend of killing off the villain in a superhero movie, Kingpin and Bullseye get to live, and are just put in prison because, quoting Matt himself,
I'm not the bad guy.
thus breaking the cycle of guys fallen on hard times being trapped in a life of crime where they become just as bad as the people who entrap them. The restored subplot with Coolio also makes me feel much better about a movie where the only black character is the villain who gets kneecapped. Although, as a Charmed fan, my first instinct is, Matt, bruv, why trying to defend the Lazarus demon? But shall we move on to a shameless chapter gushing about the stylism? A common talking point I saw everywhere in the 2010s was on how fast 2000 stuff dated. Like, usually because of how quickly technology evolved, you could have a movie released in 2001 where 20-something characters plausibly wouldn't have cell phones, a movie released in 2004 showing a teenager with a flip phone to code how rich and spoiled she is, and then a movie released in 2006 showing everyone with phones as normal. and what was in the 2000s seemed to change faster than any other decade, but of course I might be more biased because I was actually there for it. So as soon as something falls out of fashion, it spends the next 20 years or so being mocked until it's far away enough in the past to look back on with a lot more fondness, which makes me terrified of somehow getting nostalgic for the 2010s because just no. And people just loved making fun of early 2000s movies for being time capsules, and my beloved Underworld was one such victim of it. Daredevil came out the same year, and another of the things it was ridiculed for was looking like it was made in the year it was actually made. How dare you reflect the trends in filmmaking style that was indicative of the time? Bad devil. In fairness, Daredevil wears the year 2003 on its sleeve, with Double D himself wearing an all-leather ensemble that's dark enough to look black in the nighttime scenes, because this was when every other cinematic superhero had to wear black to be taken seriously, and the higher-ups argued with the costume designer about the suit looking too red, because apparently that was Spider-Man's thing. Elsewhere, Bullseye has a trench coat that the Matrix helped make a symbol of stylish badassery, but we all know Celine wore it better.
Now that's a ridiculous theory.
And Elektra scores a hat-trick by wearing a black costume that's leather, bears the midriff, and shows cleavage. Because in the girl power era, nothing said bad girl quite like covering yourself in the remains of a dead cow while exposing vital body parts, and forgetting you're in a semi-grounded superhero movie with a villain whose whole gimmick is that he never misses a target. Is anyone really surprised she lost that fight? I do love the costumes in this movie, by the way, but it's the music that really pinpoints Daredevil 2003 to that year, and we all know the scene I'm going to mention. If this movie were a person, it would see Evanescence on the TV or hear them on the radio and be like,
I invented her, you know what I mean?
This scene is my trash, and the amount of times I've watched it on a loop since last September cannot be understated. And I swear, I don't mean this in a so bad it's good way. I legitimately love the movie's stylism. From the opening shot involving this puddle reflection fake-out, then following a rat crawling along to the steps of the church, and a slow tilt up, complete with jump cuts, a close-up of blood dripping down a stained glass window, and finishing with Daredevil on the roof, wrapped around a crucifix as police searchlights linger on him. Mark Steven Johnson had a vision for this movie, and I am here for it. That 2000s pop goth vibe is everything. Daredevil tracking Bullseye while sitting among angel sculptures, symbolizing who he really is versus who he thinks he is. Elektra trading in an empty room while the lightning flashes outside, symbolizing how this pampered rich girl really has nothing but thoughts of revenge keeping her going. And even the symbolism-free stuff, like the spectacular sequence of Daredevil going after Quesada in a bar, beginning with a shot of him landing on the roof that descends right down into the reflection of a shot glass, and after some killer choreography, Daredevil jumps onto a flaming pool table and walks through the fire to deliver this line.
Time to give the devil his due!
Bad f***ing ass. That's not to say the movie's maximalist approach always works, because the murder of Elektra's father made me go, that's a little too rule of cool, and I got a little bored watching Daredevil and Bullseye fighting along the pipe organs in the church, but even then I can't bring myself to dislike Double D backflipping to dodge shards of a broken stained glass window. There's also Elektra slicing her way through umpteen hanging sheets to try and kill Daredevil, which works way better than when her own movie does a similar scene. In fact, for all my gripes with Jennifer Garner's performance, I can't fault her choreography in those two fight scenes. She trained to be able to do as much of it as she could, and her mastery of the size is pretty admirable. And I've become a lighting geek ever since 2018 when I became obsessed with Dark City, so that part of me just loves how the final fight with Kingpin happens amid this blue lighting with the rain pouring down the windows, and eventually the sprinklers adding to the proceedings. And this rule of cool blended with total seriousness that's basically a timestamp of the early 2000s holds up even better when you compare it to other superhero movies that attempted similar things and ended up just being ridiculous, like Elektra and Catwoman. There's an earnestness to Daredevil that you can feel in the stylism, whereas the other two just feel soulless. Which makes perfect sense when you know that Mark Steven Johnson was a fan of the character, and fought possibly, not literally tooth and nail, but quite close to get to direct the adaptation, whereas Elektra was a contractual obligation project that its lead actress very much wanted no part of, and Catwoman was a show that Yara Zayd went into more detail on. But I think I've given enough detail now, so shall we wrap it up? So Daredevil 2003 is now 21 years old. It is old enough to drink in America, and like many IPs that had poorly received theatrical adaptations in the 2000s, it was rebooted on television to much better success. I can remember getting the Netflix series recommended to me as soon as it came out, back when I only knew Charlie Cox as the guy from Stardust. I didn't watch, either because I simply didn't have Netflix at the time, or possibly because the mention of Daredevil conjured up thoughts of this movie's lack of popularity, and 2010's me was nothing if not a 5-foot sheep. I should probably check it out at some point, since look what its showrunner is famous for. There's a man I've called Dominus enough times for my counselor to get very worried. But anyway, discovering the director's cut of the 2003 movie earlier this year was like reconnecting with a childhood friend. Just like when I rewatched Van Helsing last year and was compelled to gush for 45 minutes about everything I loved about it. Now this video was a request, so I can't say I was super motivated, but I'm still glad I did it. Talking about films you love and why you love them is just fun, nothing more. And it definitely helped me realize just how formative Daredevil actually was for me when I first saw it. Even if I fully admit I had no horse in the race since I had no real knowledge of the character. But seeing as how Jennifer Garner is appearing in Deadpool and Wolverine this year, it seems I'm not the only one who feels this movie, or specifically Mark Steven Johnson's director's cut, deserves its own validation. After all, the whole point of Daredevil is justice for the little guy.